Hi, I'm Sally-Shakti, your visionary writing guide, and I'm a writer, coach, and ritual maker who supports visionary writers to write. Today, I am with, and I'm so excited, I'm with Henry Stokes. You can find him at Henry Stokes Writes on Instagram. Henry is a storyteller who's passionate about world mythology, mythic heroes, and fantasy worlds. He's currently writing a middle grade fantasy story. Hi, Henry. Oh,
Hi,
you mean
Sally. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.
you're so welcome. So I would love to start with some questions from you because you've done a really great job of preparing a lot of questions for us. And I'm really excited to dive into some of those questions you have, and then we can get talking as well about you and your writing process and your books.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think the thing that you touched on a little bit on your website, which I found really interesting, was around your journey. So around like what led you to see the connection between well-being and writing. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can continuously speak to that. Thank you for asking. I do think it's not addressed enough in writing, and specifically in academic writing, which is where I was coming from at the time. But I think, in writing in general, people are talking about it a lot more now, especially since, the pandemic and the lockdown. Um, but at the time when this really came together for me, I had already had a yoga practice for many years, over a decade, and I trained as a yoga teacher, but I'd never really taken off in yoga teaching because writing was really my passion. Um, so I came to yoga after my doing my initial degree in English literature. And I think writing and reading always kept me relatively isolated and in my head, especially because I often was going down an academic route with those pursuits. I was, it's I think it's a way of life um, that keeps us a lot in our heads as writers and as readers. So I came to yoga. My grandmother was a yoga teacher for 30 years. And then I kind of set out to explore that for myself. Um, and at first, it was very difficult for me to be in my body, and to be present in my body, and to be in that state that people talk about in meditation where your mind goes quiet, that sort of idealized state where the thoughts drift away, which I'm not sure really exists, but we learn through meditation to notice our thinking more, and to pay less attention to it. But as a writer and a reader who was relatively isolated in myself, I think that I was a lot in my head. And I noticed that the further I went through academia, the more I noticed that in other people as well. Particularly, writers, the more we sit at the laptop, especially now with the, blue lights on the screens, we're sitting in enclosed spaces, we're sitting, many things about being a prolific writer or somebody who spends a lot of time writing and or reading, um, are actually quite oppositional to our evolutionary process as physical human beings, in terms of how much we need to move our bodies and how much we need to be in our bodies. Um, so the more those two aspects of my life converged, the more I realized the importance of that relationship, because when I tried to keep them separate, I would often prioritize my writing, especially when I had deadlines and a big project to be working on. My writing would be my priority, but I noticed then I wouldn't move out of my seat, for weeks at a time. And the less I was doing the physical practices, and the mindset practices, because I was prioritizing my writing more, actually the less productive I was and the less healthy and happy I was becoming. So I guess that's sort of it in a nutshell.
I think, yeah, I think that's the other thing that is really such an important part of it is the productivity that ultimately there can be that. I mean, in both academic writing and also in creative writing, there's ultimately that pressure to be productive. But as you say, it's not necessarily like you could spend 8 hours writing something and not get much out of it.
You can spend 8 hours sitting at the laptop and not write much, and that was my pattern, writing my thesis. Can I touch on that? There's a few things I want to really say in response to that. I mean, one thing is the ethics and the culture of productivity, which I think is harmful in so many ways, for so many reasons, not just for writers, but in the context of writing specifically, I'm much, much more interested in getting back to writing as a process rather than a product. Um, that I think has been really helpful, not only for my writing practice and my creative voice and style to evolve, but also again for my well-being and for being able to actually write in the ways that I need and want to write, when I can look at it as a process rather than a product with an outcome. um I lost the train of thought of where else I was going to go with that.
Like, I mean, that's something that I feel like I've learned over a long period of time as well. That sort of 10, 10, 15 years, that it is ultimately, it's about the process. I think that can sometimes get lost in that pressure to be productive, to see that word count increase, to get to the end of your project, whether it is academic or creative. That there is that. I think that one of the big things that I've learned is that it's a craft, and I mean, you should be enjoying every word. And I think that's the thing that you talk on Instagram so much about, that I think is so great, that you're shining a light on that it should be always in a positive, like you should be getting as close as you can to that positive creative space. So I think it's really, really great what you're doing. And do you work just now with academic writers or with creative writers as well?
This is an interesting point, that I think is really good for me to consider, because I feel now that the writers I work with, whether they are in academia or in more creative areas of their writing or anywhere in between, the people who come to me are the people who don't feel like they fit into the typical or traditional form or structure, or the box, if you like,
Mm,
of what is expected of them in that genre or in that style or in that context. Because often I'm working with people who have new ideas and new visions, or are drawing on um, older cultures that have been suppressed by colonialism and suppressed by um, the very culture that academia reinforces. And so those writers, having new things to say, are also consciously or unconsciously looking for or needing to find new forms in which to say it. And so I work a lot with people who are pushing at the edges of the pre-existing forms, and looking at ways that they can transform that through their writing. And those people might be neurodiverse. They almost certainly identify as spiritual in some way, or countercultural, or all of those things.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the big questions is why do you think this impacts writers so much? I mean, it does seem to be that there's a lot of challenges that writers face, like burnout, um, like creatively, but also on the opposite end of the spectrum, writer's block as well.
Yeah, and I think that some of the things I touched on earlier about writers specifically, the amount of time we spend sitting is one thing. The amount of time we spend looking at the screen is another. Those things are in some ways specific to writers, and in some ways kind of specific to most people nowadays. But those things for writers are really important. Like, how much time are we actually getting out of the seat and moving our bodies and getting into our bodies? And I think actually there's a connection there between what we call writer's block and what then presents afterwards as burnout, which is like, if I was when I was writing my thesis and I would sit at my laptop for hours and not write, but I would be thinking, I need to stay here until I've written what I think I need to write. That feeds itself. That's a loop. That's a cycle that feeds itself, where I'm not writing, but I'm also not doing the things that are going to support me to actually write. I'm sitting at the laptop thinking that I need to sit here until I write. But what would actually help me more would be to get up and move my body, go out and see people, speak to people, get some air, get some movement, move my mind in different ways, because then it's often that the writing can then happen in the background, and we can come back fresh to to the screen, and be a lot more productive when we've kind of taken some time away from the writing, especially if we've got to that stage where we're really stuck and we've really got writer's block.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I've definitely experienced on both sides. So I did do an honors thesis, and I definitely went down that path of I didn't have much class time at that point, so I definitely was just sitting there, felt that pressure to do it for 8 hours, 10 hours of just trying to work on it. And as you say, there's that pressure. I mean, that you've got that goal to do it, and it's not productive because it doesn't ultimately, like, if you get out of balance. When I was doing it, I was definitely out of balance. I was not healthy. I was not eating well. That it ultimately impacts your productivity as well. And conversely, I have also experienced that on the creative side. That with my second novel, I really went down that road of perfection, like absolute perfectionism, and trying to get that story just like no problems. And ultimately, I ended up just feeling like I had to sit at the computer and work on it every free moment I got. And conversely, especially since I had it was just after my daughter was born that I was working on that, that there was almost like a guilt of, if I spent time away from the screen, that I felt guilty that I wasn't making progress. But then when I sat down at the computer to work on it, I also wasn't in the right headspace to work creatively. I mean, it definitely doesn't lead to progress. I worked on that novel for 10 years, and I did 5-page run rewrites of it, trying to get it absolutely perfect, and ultimately, just that desire for perfectionism just did not lead to progress. So it's a very important balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And oh, sorry, I lost my train again. Sorry. Carry on, because I want to hear more about your books as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So I mean, what I'm currently working on, and I think it's come out of a much better space creativity, is a middle grade fantasy novel. It's something that I actually started writing for my daughter. So she's 7 years old now. I've got two. I've got one who's 7, one who's 3. So I'm going to write another book for the 3-year-old. But it's a world that I've been exploring for a long time. I've got a real love of mythology and legend and fantasy, and these stories of heroes versus villains. So I'd built up, especially in terms of world religions. There's so many of those stories that I just love, and these archetypes and these pantheons of gods, that I started with a pantheon. That was where the story started, and I fleshed out this world and was looking for a way to tell a story within that. And I spent a lot of time thinking about other forms, and ultimately decided on a middle grade fantasy story because for me, I could have written a young adult or an adult fantasy story, but looking at, I mean, obviously, I love my family, but it is, having work and family is a challenge to find time for writing. So thinking in kind of the way of the obstacle is the way. How could, how could I actually use that, and use my relationship with my daughter to, produce a beautiful story. So it's something that I wrote specifically for her, but I think the message really relates with a lot of people. It is a story about a young girl who is an elven princess who becomes lost in an enchanted forest, and it's about her journey to return home. Along the way, she meets a former adventurer named Ravaluna, who is a believer in the moon goddess, and she becomes her protector and um, and vows to return her home. But ultimately, Ravaluna herself ends up in danger at the hands of an evil sorceress. So Aurelia has to make this difficult decision. Has to decide what is the right thing to do and really face her fears and take a leap of faith. So I think it's a story that as I say, I specifically wrote for my daughter and some of the things that she's going through at that age. So I think that it's really important for that middle grade, kind of aged 6 to 10 age group.
I think that's so beautiful, Henry. And I would love you to talk more about what it means for you to actually have a specific reader in mind when you're writing. How has that helped or changed your writing process, especially when that reader is your daughter?
Yeah, she was very challenging initially because I had this idea of a girl sets out on an adventure, and a lot of it, really the writing process for this was very different to kind of sit at a computer and type. I was making up the story often as I went along, and really like verbally, oral storytelling. So there was a certain amount of flexibility in, I would say, maybe she does this now. I was dealing with a very reluctant hero in the sense of I presented a lot of opportunities for this hero to go off on an adventure, but her home, I think I maybe painted the picture a little bit too beautifully. That I said, is it time for the hero to go off on an adventure now? And my daughter was saying, no, I think it's time for another one of those princess parties. Like, so yeah, does she want to go off on this quest? Does she want to save this town? No, I think she's okay where she is. So it really forced me to think about it and also go into a lot of these stories of folklore and fairy tales. And it's interesting that kind of challenge in telling it for one person led me to see, hey, this idea of an enchanted forest, it comes up so often in stories that we tell, especially for young girls. And there's a quote from D.H. Lawrence that mythology is an attempt to describe something which is so deep that it goes beyond, like I'm paraphrasing, but it goes beyond words. But this idea of an enchanted forest, there's something in the human condition that really allows us to connect with that. So it was an interesting location to explore, and one that came about really from that process. But it has really, in terms of my storytelling method, as I say, it very much used to be just sit at a computer and type. But I think this story, I'm in a much better place creatively because telling the story out loud, and also I'm finding better balance with, I've got a pen and paper, and I'll write on the train, I'll write in the evening and won't look at the computer. So it does give me a bit of a break from that. And it's really come full circle, I think, storytelling, in that I'm now telling a story to my daughter, out loud, verbal storytelling, in the same way that my dad used to make up stories for me and tell them to me, and in the same way that his mum used to make up stories for him and tell them to him. So yeah, it's a beautiful tradition, and I think something that's really part of the human condition, that desire to tell stories and hear stories.
That is so beautiful, really. It reminds me of my granddad telling stories to me, and I've got this typed out version of the story that he always used to tell us when I was young. It was called The Greedy Children. It was a little moral tale, but there was so much imagination in it. He had these two kids, brother and sister, go off to this magical land where once you started to eat something, you had to finish it. Um, so they were there, and they had like, you know, uh banana skin boats and lollipop oars and lemonade river. But once you start something, you had to finish it. So they then had to obviously they started something they couldn't finish. They got put in this prison, but they realized that the prison was made out of the bars were made out of licorice, and the walls were made out of I think like um probably something like treacle tarts or something, like, you know, that my granddad would have been really kind of pertinent for him at the time. And so they ate their way through the prison.
It's one way to get out. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, that connection of sitting with my granddad every time I saw him and hearing that story told over and over again, you know, there's such a bond that's created through that. And what I love about what you're saying is how you have found a way, or a way has found you to write and to tell your stories and to do what you love, that doesn't actually take you away from your family, which you also love, but it helps to create a stronger bond through your passion with the people you love. um there's so many things I want to talk about with that. um One is like, how do you then square that with being um still focused on your writing and making this kind of like a professional craft, and having deadlines, and actually having something to complete, that there's something more, slightly more pressing than it being this ongoing evolution of telling a story to your daughter?
Yeah. I think that I think it being a story like that, I think it supports the progress, because ultimately I got to a place where I mean, it's difficult because you can tell a story like once I finally um, print it out and tell it to her. It's going to be, I could tell it in a night, but it takes a lot longer to write that. And I think that one of the real challenges for writers is that, and I think I feel that it's maybe why writing is susceptible to things like, you know, mental health issues and things like that, and mental health challenges, is it is a long process. I mean, a song can be written in, you know, 5-10 minutes. A painting can be done in an hour, but a story takes time. So I think for me, the big learning through this has been that just to enjoy that, as you say, enjoy the craft of storytelling and enjoy the process. And just for me, telling the story out loud as well helped free me of some of the inhibitions that I think when you type a story, uh, there's no kind of filter that you can just keep on putting out words and putting out words and then go, the word count's increasing, it's good. But when you tell a story out loud, there's an interesting thing which happens in that you have to drop the way that you're trying to talk, and you naturally, when you open your mouth and you talk, you naturally kind of find your own voice. And it was a different writing style that I found. So I think it's actually really helped my process. And ultimately, the thing which really matters is that you tell the story which you want to tell, in your own voice. So I think that the measuring of the progress, you can actually see it better when you're doing. You know, for me, I make a commitment to try and write every day. I set myself a target of 250 words. and I post about that quite a lot on my Instagram. That just to it helps me because it keeps me accountable. But I generally do get about 250 words or 500 words a day. And then in setting myself a smaller goal like that, I can focus on just getting that part right and just figuring out what is the thing that I want to say at this point. Sometimes it is just traveling through a location, or it's a particular story beat. But I think when you focus in on that one section, it does allow you to focus on just telling it the way you want to tell it.
So I'm hearing from that you're, in a way, it feels like you're quite focused on the craft, and you will craft those 250 words rather than go for 750 or 1,000. And so I'm interested as well in what you said about social media and that keeping you accountable, for kind of hitting your targets. And how do you see social media in terms of writers and writing community? And is it distraction? Is it supportive, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think when I really got into it, and this was something that I didn't do well with my first book. So I really was of the opinion that when you're a writer, you're a creative, and you don't want to be a business person. So I neglected that to my own detriment. This time around, I really embraced it, and I think that at first there was a pressure to kind of compete, and to see some of these other writers have got huge followings, and I think that there can be some negative aspects to social media in that sense. But I analyzed it in terms of what's important to me. And for me, I love going to museums. So that's something that I post about on my Instagram a lot. And it also reminds me to get out of the house and do things to actually look for new content. And having to post those regular writing updates does remind me to make time each week. It can be, I've got a difficult schedule. I work full time. So I'm working 8:30 to 5. I am doing school pickups, daycare pickups, cooking dinner, cleaning the house. I generally don't get done until about 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And then I've sort of got an hour, maybe 2, for myself. So having that really small, as I said before, having that really small goal of just 250 words, and if I hit that, I'm happy. I won't push past that. Sometimes I do get lucky. Sometimes I do get like 500 words in, and that's great. But if I hit 250 words, I'm okay. But over time, that social media, that's how we connected. I have to remind myself that it is a social community, and I found it really positive to go out there, and writers and creatives are supporting each other and building these networks. And I think if you focus on that and not just trying to get as many likes as possible, but also connecting with other people and supporting other people, then you do build those connections. So I think there is some positives there. But that must be something. Do you see that with other creatives and writers, that social media, the positive sides, the negative sides? How do writers deal with that?
Yeah, I definitely see both. And I think as well there are certain writers or types of writers who are much more resistant to social media, and like you said, the kind of business and self-promotion aspect of it, coming through from sort of academia and more sort of left-wing radical politics. I noticed that a lot of writers in that context would be a lot more resistant to the businessy aspect or the self-promotion aspect, the marketing aspect. And as you said, potentially to our detriment, when we do that. Certainly for myself, when I wasn't on social media as a writer. And as you said, the positives, community connection, especially when it is so important. I think we touched a little bit on writing being isolating. If we are spending a lot of time by ourselves in our writing, then it's important, either whatever ways we can, to find communities, especially of other writers who can support us and who can share our challenges and concerns, and give empathetic feedback or support. Those kind of networks are really important. And then there are other writers who will use social media specifically as a marketing tool, for their writing and for their books and for their business, and they can be very successful if they have some good strategies for that. I've been, I kind of straddle both sides of that. As I said, coming through academia, initially I was not engaging with social media as a writer particularly. I did a little bit, but a lot of the time I found in that context that I was afraid to really share who I am, and be fully open about what I really wanted to say and what I really wanted to write about. It felt too exposing to me at the time to be on social media, and I was very influenced by this kind of negative perception of that all self-promotion is bad. And I was touched by that a lot, and I kept myself off of social media, and I kept myself quite small as a result. But a real positive experience that I had just yesterday was when I was working with a client who I met on Instagram, through social media, and they'd messaged me and said that they were really struggling with a certain aspect of their writing. And actually in the message they asked if I could recommend some other writers, but before I'd even got to that part of the message, I was already sending them links on Instagram for other writers to look at, who were working in ways that I felt could be really inspiring and supportive, for the problem that this person had. And I noticed the value of that when I was writing my poetry specifically. I found it difficult to find examples and people who I could really follow, who were working in the way that felt that I felt like I wanted to be writing, because they weren't on social media, they weren't doing the self-promotion, or they quite often didn't exist. So it was difficult for me to find role models for my own writing. And noticing yesterday that I was able to immediately support one of my clients by sharing the work of other writers with them in a way that I felt would be supportive, I was really grateful that those writers were on Instagram, that they're sharing what they do, that they're being public about what they create, because that gives so much permission and so much inspiration to other writers and to other people who might not otherwise find those kind of guiding lights in their writing journey. So I really do think it's really valuable for writers to be open about their process, because that helps as well, and about what they're creating, because it's so important for writers to form those kind of networks and communities where we can see what other people are writing and how they're creating, and be inspired by that, rather than kind of feeling like we're in a vacuum, and that nobody else is doing what we're doing, or nobody else understands what we're trying to create.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, my idea of writing 250 words a day, that also came from Instagram. I can't even remember who mentioned it, but I remember reading it. I passed it, I absorbed it, and then I was thinking, hey, that's a good idea. I think that can fit with my current, my current schedule. So I tried it out, and it's been working for me. And I mean, on my Instagram as well, I'm talking about my successes, but I'm also want to share my storytelling journey in an authentic way. And bring up the challenges, such as it's difficult to find time. I think a lot of people are now balancing their creative projects with needing to work a job to pay the bills, with having other time commitments, spending time with, especially as a parent, spending, needing to balance being a parent. And sharing that, I wanted to be authentic and be honest and just say that this is the reality, that I do have wins and I do have successes, but that there's difficult parts to it. And it was really because I felt like I'd just been posting the pretty parts of writing, and I was like, you know what, it's not always like this. Like, it's not always sitting in a cafe and getting lost in a story. But the thing that really surprised me was just how many beautiful responses I got, from yourself as well, and from other people I'd connected with, that were just saying, yeah, I'm dealing with the same thing. I'm dealing with the same challenges. And knowing, I think there's support, but I think an even more central part of it is just knowing you're not alone. There's other people that are facing the same challenges, and that in and of itself can just be so helpful.
Yeah, thank you. It can really help to break some of those senses of isolation. Um, so what's next for you, Henry? How close are you to completing the story that you're working on, and what comes next?
Yeah, so I'm 25,000 words at the moment. I think it's going to be finished at about 30,000 words. So I'm going to be finished possibly this weekend. It's been going, yeah. I don't want to, I don't want to fully commit to that, but yeah, I'm getting to the very, very end. I've only got about 5 story beats left to write. So that one's nearly done, and then I should be finished this month, and then I've planned to edit for the next month and the month after, just because it's a smaller story. I'm expecting that the editing process will be shorter. So that's going to be published this year. I haven't got a set date, but I'll update on my Instagram once I do. And in terms of what's next, as I said, I've already been exploring this world for a while, and I've been really enjoying the world building and meeting the characters and telling their stories. So I really want to continue that, and I'm planning another book in this series, and it'll involve a lot of the same characters and also some new characters. So I'm
Wow,
really excited to share that with my readers.
that's wonderful. And are you planning to take a break in between?
Um, no, I enjoy the process too much. Yeah, I really, once you get a good thing going, I think I'll continue that. I'm not. I think that the publishing process is going to be, there's a lot of time in that. There's editing, and then there's going to be, contacting book reviewers, book bloggers, submitting to awards, and marketing, self promotion. So I think that that's naturally going to take time away from actually creating. So I'm going to need to balance that. But yeah, I will see once I've gone through that whether I need to take a week off or something.
At least. But I think it's great to build that marketing and promotion time into your planning as well, to be really aware that that does take time, and it's an essential part of the process. I mean, once you've written your book and put it out there, you want readers to read it, and I say that as if it's not obvious, but this is where I think there's a lot of writers do have blocks about social media and self-promotion. But finishing the book is not the end of the process. We write, or we can write for many reasons, partly for our own, for our own process, but also, if we've gone to that effort and length and commitment to actually get a book out there, we do want people to read it. And so that is an essential part of the process that I think maybe takes some writers by surprise, or is missed out of the kind of the planning and structuring and timing process.
Yeah, and I think that, like, that would be my lining as well, from my first two books as well, is that allow that time for editing to get the story right. And also, you want to if you've told a story, then you really want to set it up for success. That there's a business side of it, but I mean, the way I see it, I've got a duty, an obligation, and a responsibility to put that effort into the business side of my book to make sure that other people find out the story. There's a lot of other stories out there, and it's just I think it's just important to share it in an authentic way. What is the story? Tell people. Look for people on Instagram, on YouTube, on book blogging sites, on Goodreads, on all these platforms that you think would find your story interesting, and just think about it in the sense of just telling them about what your story is, and who you are. I don't think it should ever be. It should always be authentic, and I think that's the key thing that people connect with. That it is true. It is honest.
That's such great advice, Henry. And I think one thing I would just love to ask you, for clarity, is how do you publish? How do you publish? Are you self-publishing, or are you publishing through a publisher?
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think that I'm definitely going to go the self-publishing route. That was another thing that I think was a misstep on my second book, is that I really wanted to go down the traditional publishing route. And I think that you could probably make a separate video just on the well-being challenges of going down the traditional publishing route, that it is very, very difficult to get into. And especially if you're a first-time author, it is very, very difficult to get that recognition. And that's why I think social media is so important, that even if you are going into one of the traditional publishing houses, you do need to have that following to get taken seriously.
Yeah, especially I think.
Yeah, and I think that for me, I've got enough experience that I'm comfortable with things like arranging for a professional cover designer, arranging the marketing side and coming up with an author plan. Some of that comes from my day job and working in the business world, that you do get that familiarity with just how do you build a plan, how do you manage that as a project, really. And also for myself, I feel that I've got a lot more creative control over it. That you can go through Amazon, you can go through Kindle Direct Publishing, you can get some real marketing benefits by just committing there. But then you ultimately do have that creative control over your project. You can tell your story exactly the way you want to tell it.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for so many people who might identify themselves as visionary writers, who have a story to tell that, as I said at the beginning, doesn't necessarily fit squarely into those traditional forms, and says something new in a slightly new or different way. Self-publishing, I think, for many people now is a way to, as you said, have that creative control over the form and the structure of your storytelling and the content, and to reach people. We're doing our own marketing through social media. We have the technology and the possibility to bring our own books to market. And like you said, there's so many politics around that, and so many different perspectives, and so many positives and negatives for choosing which route you want to take. But I do think that self-publishing doesn't have the same level of stigma about it that it has had in the past, for good reason, because it's helping to get new work out to new readers, or new writing out to new readers, without that kind of gatekeeper, where so much politics actually prevents so many people from having their voices heard, in a simplified way of putting it.
Yeah, that's so true. That I think that I mean, it can feel like gatekeeping. That especially in some environments, you need to find a literary agent, and you need to get that literary agent to agree to represent you, and then that's the only way into the publishing houses. A lot of them are not necessarily open for submissions either. So I think that especially where you're talking about writers that are coming up with something new, exploring new forms, exploring new voices, that self-publishing really does have a lot of benefits. And as you said, it doesn't have that stigma, but also a lot has changed in even 10 years. That so much is now, that stigma has really changed in 10 years, but also the possibilities are now so much more open than they were 10 years ago. And also you can do it at like no cost, essentially. So if you're a beginning author, then there's so little risk that you can do things like print on demand and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That was not possible, 10, certainly 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think for beginning authors who haven't already got that platform and aren't moving through a traditional publishing route, being able to self-publish is a very powerful way to build confidence and connection and community through sharing your passion without the kind of roadblocks that might otherwise be in the way. And to build to I guess to take action towards actually moving in the direction of your dreams, putting your work out there, meeting other people, making connections with writers, and making it real in ways that perhaps some people do and can and have spent many years kind of holding back and waiting for the right time, the right opportunity, the right doors to open. But there's a lot of momentum that we can create through self-publishing, where we can already be getting out there, putting our words out there, connecting with the right people, and building, as I said, community and connection and confidence through that process.
Yeah, that's so great. And I think that, as you said, people that want to tell, that have new voices, they absolutely should feel like they have a right and a responsibility also to speak their voice and be heard, because there's so many other people that will resonate with that as well. That it is so important to feel like you can.
Thank you, Henry. I think we could talk for ages on this. But let's finish for now by saying how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, sure thing. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been great to discuss. In terms of how people can keep in touch with me, follow my Instagram at Henry Stokes Writes, or one word, at Henry Stokes Writes. And that's also my YouTube handle as well.
Oh yeah, I didn't know you're on YouTube. I have to find you there. Great. You learn something all the time. Yeah. And if you want to keep in touch with me, I'm at Writing Thriving. That's also all one word, at Writing Thriving. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, all at the same, at Writing Thriving. Great.
Thanks so much, Sally-Shakti. I really appreciate it. This was a great discussion.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks everyone for being here. Bye.
Bye.